Did you know that the forgotten founder of Zionism went on to play a leading role in Agudas Yisrael, or that Rav Chatzkel Abramsky was responsible for the continued presence of the Muslim Waqf on Har HaBayis? It turns out that the margins of history tell the real story. Behind the Times dives into the big concepts and overlooked moments that carry vast meaning, all through the lens of Torah and rabbinic thought. Join me, Gedalia Gutentag, as I go behind the Times to explore the forgotten history, remarkable personalities, and transformative moments that shape current events and explain how we got here. Behind the Times with Gedalia Gutentag. 1 year as Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, approached, the phone rang in the headquarters of the Bnei Akiva youth movement. On the line was an unexpected messenger, an associate of the Ponevezh Yeshiva's of Shach. His message was just as unexpected. It concerned football. The Bnei Akiva movement was planning a football tournament in honor of Independence Day. Teams representing its northern and southern branches would compete against each other in a festive match. Rav Shach asked that a message be conveyed to the movement's leaders. And these were his incredible words. "We have different views about Yom HaAtzmaut," he said. "But think about the educational message that you're sending. If a day possesses sanctity, if it possesses Kedusha, as you teach that Yom HaAtzmaut does, in fact, if it's a day on which you say Hallel with a bracha, then what are you teaching young people by staging a football tournament as the centerpiece of the celebration?" That powerful argument is documented in the autobiography of former Chief Rabbi Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau. And what's so powerful about it is because it accepted Bnei Akiva's own premises. Rav Shach wasn't asking them to abandon their views about Yom HaAtzmaut. He was just asking them to think through the educational implications of those views. If the day was truly holy, then how could football be at the center of it? And the end of the story, writes Rabbi Lau, is that the message got through, and indeed the tournament was cancelled. Now to me, what's remarkable about that story is what it says about leadership. Obviously, Bnei Akiva weren't about to adopt the Ponevezh worldview, and Rav Shach knew that he had no entree over there. Yet as a Torah leader, he was thinking about the chinuch of people beyond his own constituency, people who were never going to be answerable to him. He wondered, and his point was about the educational message being conveyed to Jews whose worldview differed totally, very deeply from his own. If he could prevent what he saw as an educational mistake, even within their own frame of reference, then he felt an achrayus to act. This is a story about Gadlus. But it's also a perfect introduction, my dear listeners, to today's topic, from football fever. Because it's that time again. Last week was the NBA final. And this week, it's football, or as American listeners might call it, soccer. And the Americans are doing the hosting this time. Because every 4 years, the world descends into a strange collective fever and a mania around football. Entire countries and their politicians find themselves, every politician needs to make a reference to it. They need to be in on the know. Offices are empty in time for matches and families gather together. And this grips most of the world. Most of the world, in fact, not America, where despite hosting this year's tournament, America has never really made inroads as an American sport. Perhaps the last bastion of American exceptionalism, the fact that America has a World Series, which strangely enough, it has been not many countries play. But indeed, this year, the World Cup, or as Israelis call it, the Mondial, as other countries also call it, the World Cup, the World Football Cup, and yes, for the purpose of this podcast, it will remain football, not soccer, is being staged this year. And that phenomenon, like everything, in that golden Yiddish phrase that I remember my grandfather using, it says, "Wie es kristeltzach as yiddeltzach." As the Christians do, the Jews do. But it's much more, what a lovely evocative phrase it is in Yiddish. As the non-Jews act, so too go the Jews. And indeed, a phenomenon like this, a global tournament like this, doesn't pass over the frum world. Obviously, there are those who come to watch, and lots of people who watch. Then at a certain stage, You always think, what happens at a certain stage? It becomes, every pulpit rabbi and kiruv rabbi feels this kind of irresistible need to reference football and turn every match and every play and the whole thing and a missed penalty into the subject of the droshas and to a nimshal for Torah and life. And that's the second stage. And finally, the last stage comes when the mashgiach in the yeshiva feels the need to weigh in because it's the talk of the town as the finals approach. And at that point, you know that the tournament has truly arrived, and that happens. Now, into that last category of the mashgiach in the yeshiva, I think that this is where this humble podcast falls. So I want to take the opportunity to explore some aspects of this enduring fascination, and I think you can say equally enduring clash between sports and our machshava. When you look at how far back the urge to stampede around a field, chasing a ball, actually goes, what's remarkable is just how deeply these games seem to be ingrained in the human psyche. The need for relaxation, for entertainment, for competition, and the remarkably simple ways of fulfilling those needs, they appear almost universal. So a little bit, you can do your brief Google search and you're going to find that the origins of balls and ball games can be traced back thousands of years. Apparently they were the Olmec, known as the rubber people, created Mesoamerica's first great civilization. In other words, it's Central and South America, Central America. They're finding this is the places that later turned into the Maya and the Aztecs. They discovered balls there, very ancient ones, in fact. In 1992, archaeologists uncovered the oldest known American ball, not North American, but Central American, from a spring in Mexico. And it was actually more than 3,000 years old, and yet, incredibly, it retained that smell of latex that anyone's going to be familiar from those rubber gloves. Across Central America, which was where these games seem to have developed, over 1,000 ancient ball courts have been excavated. And that's very remarkable to think of how those ball games started so close to home in that area. And so obviously ancient China has its version apparently called Kuju, a game in which a leather ball was kicked through a small opening in a net. So it's, I suppose it sounds like five-a-side or something like that, one of the earliest known football-like sports. And the Greeks and Romans had independently, and I'm not sure there's any suggestion there was this kind of cross-contamination or cross-fertilization, rather, that the one society took from another. I don't think that's the case. I think it's just people have this instinct. You can roll something up into a ball, and once it's on a ball, you just have this urge to give it a kick or to throw it. And so the Greeks and Romans had various things that were similar to football and rugby, and I'm talking about in the British sense of the term. And that's a key human impulse. Get a ball, get a crowd together and divide it into teams and compete. And obviously that leads right up to the development in European, particularly in Britain, of football, where soccer, football was this game where it involved, apparently, these were very rough sports in which hundreds of people could compete without rules and probably very violently as well, basically smashing each other in those far less civilized times. But again, the instinct is very ancient, and we know it across different civilizations. Now, fascinatingly, it was actually occurred to me that the traces of that impulse for games, and for these particular games involving round things and things putting things, kicking things and putting things from one hole into the next, they appear in all sorts of unexpected places. A few years ago, we went to visit on the Golan. There is a magnificent fortress, which is entirely different from the fortress in last week's episode. This is known as the Nimrod Fortress, and it's a castle actually not built by crusaders, but built and improved by different Muslim dynasties. First built around 1229 by the Ayyubids, and then it was massively expanded by the Mamluks, who were a later dynasty, a century later. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there you see the lion symbol of the Sultan and Emperor Baybars, who was the Mamluk Sultan over there. I think it's there, if I'm not mistaken. But what really caught my attention when visiting was just this thing which is just so remarkable and human. One of these little details in which you see close up across centuries, you almost come face to face with the people who'd stood in a particular spot hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Because in this castle, it's separated, for those who visit, separated between an upper and a lower part. I suppose you'd have European castles had like a keep and, the inner defensive part and then a lower outer part. So I think in there was the remains of a guard post between the upper and lower part of Nimrod Fortress. There is the very clear outline of two parallel rows of holes, kind of drilled, small holes drilled into the rock and worn into the stone all those centuries ago. And that is thought to be the ancient Middle Eastern and popular today global game of Mancala, in which you kind of have these two parallel rows of holes and then you move pieces around or whatever the game goes. And it's just actually it's so human when you see this. They're a reminder that even soldiers, you can imagine these Muslim soldiers there at the strategic frontier. They needed something. They were bored. So, they smoked a cigarette or talked of back home and they played Mancala. But actually, we don't need to look as far back as the Aztecs or Ayubid soldiers to know that ball games were popular in the ancient world, because our own sources, our own Makoros in Halacha tell us so as well. Now, it all starts with a very fascinating and famous passage in the Yerushalmi in Tanis. That famous passage goes through the 5 things that happened on Shabbos Tammuz. And later on in this excerpt of the Yerushalmi, it goes on to discuss various other calamities. And it's Chazal describe the fate of a very prosperous town known as Tur Shimon, which we don't know where it is. It says that in Tur Shimon have a mapik telas movan de garbin de markoila kaita kolarubas shuba. Tur Shimon used to produce hundreds of baskets of, I think, either mustard or something else, and every Erev Shabbos or dates. The point being, on Erev Shabbos it was a very prosperous town. And the Gemara says, V'loma chorav, the Yerushalmi rather says, why was it destroyed? Yesh oimrim b'pnei znus, some people say because of immorality. V'yesh oimrim, and this is the incredible thing, some people say, shehayu mesachkim bekadur, they played ball. I mean, that is incredible to think of. Straight out of the Yerushalmi about the time of the destruction of 2,000 years ago, destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and Yehuda and the different towns. They played ball. There we have it. We don't know exactly what game they were describing. It's not the NBA, basketball, or the Premier League football. But one thing is clear. Somewhere in Roman era Eretz Yisrael, the Jews were playing ball games. So actually, what was wrong with this? And why did Tur Shimon deserve to be destroyed because of it? So obviously, it depends who you ask. The Beis Yosef quotes the version as saying that it took place on Shabbos. And the issue at stake is that what could be wrong? There's various things wrong, possibly on Shabbos, but one of the most direct things is that because on Shabbos you're meant to be learning, and it's not meant to be a day of doing things, as the Novi says, you've got to honor Shabbos by just living differently than you would during the week. Therefore, ball games are not appropriate, and if they're not appropriate, then the ball is muktzah. So there's one version that, and in fact, the Shulchan Aruch himself, Yosef Karen, the Shulchan Aruch, says in Simshin Ches that also lischok b'Shabbos v'Yom Tov b'Kadur. There it is. In 500 years ago, the Shulchan Aruch is saying no playing with balls on Shabbos. So there you see balls again making an appearance in halacha. But the Ramah says yesh matir and v'nagula hokel, that the custom is to be mekel. And the issue at stake, though, is over here, again, because the Rekeach, who explains that the issue in Tur Shimon, the reason it was destroyed, is because they were playing ball and not learning Torah. The problem is not playing ball. It's not like kicking a ball around or shooting a few hoops in the American idiom is problematic. The problem is doing it on a Shabbos, and the problem doing a Shabbos is because of Muktzah, and it's Muktzah because that's not the idea that you're meant to be doing on Shabbos, because you're meant to is bittul Torah. And I think that same thing is other poskim such as Shiboile Haleket later endorses that idea that it's because ultimately it becomes Muktzah because of bittul Torah. But obviously there's a wider machlokas about, again, remember, this is so significant because this is a Yerushalmi saying that they played ball and that was the trigger for the destruction, right? Imagine that it's almost in the same class as the Sinas Chinom, which destroyed other things as well. How could it be such a stringent thing for punishment, for playing, severe punishment rather, for playing ball? The Vilna Gaon says, no, the problem in Tur Shimon was not because of the ball itself, it's because it was Hotzah they were carrying outside. So if so, they were Mechal Shabbos. But anyway, there's various approaches over here to explain what actually was happening in Tur Shimon, and therefore what was the trigger of the Churban over there. But later on, just to round out the halachic aspect of over here, is that the poskim up to today discuss games, ball, and more widely games on Shabbos, because it could be the same thing as playing chess on Shabbos. If the underlying rationale is that you shouldn't be doing it on Shabbos because it's not in the spirit of Shabbos, therefore it could potentially become, chess pieces would potentially become muktzah, and therefore would be forbidden to move them on Shabbos, regardless of even if you're sitting inside. So obviously, the proverbial local Orthodox rabbi, LOR, needs to be consulted, but I think broadly speaking, is within the Ramaz Heta, or within the Ramaz leniency, that Ashkenazim, because Sephardim absolutely rule that there's no such thing, no playing with a ball on Shabbos. Although Ashkenazim permit it according to the Ramah, that Heta, that leniency, is heavily circumscribed. And Rabbi Tzion Abba Shaul, a great Sephardic posek of a few decades ago, says that to Shulchan Aruch, it's actually concerns beyond Muktzah and therefore applies even in the modern era. Whereas others, such as Rav Eliashiv or Shlomo Zalman, say that the balls that were forbidden back in the day were balls that were just stuff, collection of rags, but that didn't have a concept. They weren't called a kli, they weren't a vessel, and therefore couldn't be moved. They'd be Muktzah, but those which are kind of match the balls that we use today would be. But anyway, bottom line, I think it's pretty clear that there's no great endorsement and enthusiasm for playing ball on Shabbos at all, and certainly would be forbidden if it's in an organized group setting, such as, and that was precisely Rav Shach's point. So in summary, it turns out, I think, that football fever, frum football fever, is not a modern phenomenon. Long before the World Cup or the NBA, people were arguing. There was a discussion about games and recreation. And it's easy to imagine somewhere in the ancient world, an ancient yeshiva, a mashkiach, speaking passionately about the fascination with ball games, warning Talmidim that too much attention was being devoted to the local equivalent of football or perhaps the Olympics. And you know what? I think it's definitely easy to see the point at which a healthy activity, such as a recreational activity, becomes problematic. And I was just thinking about this, about when a game becomes an identity. So Rabbi Moshe Shapiro, the great Baal Machshava, Nifta 10 plus years ago, noted something very interesting about the word, the Hebrew word for a game, shashua. Shashua is a game. And the root is shin ayin, but it's a double root, shin ayin. Now, shin ayin, shoya, means to turn, right? To turn to something, turn aside. So, for example, the Torah says that Hashem didn't turn towards the carbon of Hevel. Hevel minchasoi lo sho'o, shin ayin hey. So the root is to turn aside. So what does the double root, shin ayin mean, or the repetition? What does it mean? It means turning to turn. That's what it means. It's something circular. You turn to turn. And that, says Rabbi Moshe Shapiro, is exactly the description of a game. What's the point of a game? The point of a game is that it's a game. It's that it has no point. There's no external goal, to use that phrase from football. There's no external purpose. It's only lately, that games become professional and they've got money and etc. But the point at its core, a game is turning to turn. The point of the game is the thing itself, and that's why you enjoy it. Because why do you enjoy it? Because it means nothing. That's what the stakes are nothing. It means nothing. It means just pure relaxation, and that's the focus. That's the purpose of it. That's why we were created. We were created with the need to relax. How do you relax? By doing something that doesn't have necessarily a point. It's just enjoyable. You turn to turn. I think that shows, obviously, Moshe Shapiro's explanation reveals the extraordinary depth of the Torah's own, language, ability to convey concepts over here. But I think that obviously shows the danger of games. Because when something is fundamentally meaningless becomes invested with meaning, when it becomes, you become emotionally attached to it, and you have kind of develop a loyalty or devotion, and when it goes so far as to become part of your identity, then obviously that crosses the line from being just a pastime to being something problematic. And I remember years ago about as a teenager, I watched a Sunday afternoon football game, and I just remember clearly this scene and being struck as a fairly young teen by the pointlessness of that the person involved across the line. Well, the scene was as follows. I remember, for those who know what I'm talking about, in the English Premier League, the Football League, you have Newcastle United. For those who don't know, Newcastle is across the road from Gateshead, across the river rather, from Gateshead, Ira Kodesh, and they have the big local football and sports team. And there they had a Sunday afternoon game, and Newcastle had lost. And the stadium emptied out half an hour later, and then the camera pans over the stadium, totally empty. Tens of thousands of empty seats. And in the middle, one seat was filled with a Newcastle supporter still in his black and white striped T-shirt kit. And he was sitting there, head in his hand, crying. At the time, it struck me, even as a teenager, that this did not make any sense whatsoever. It was so pointless that the guy was literally in mourning for the fact his team had lost. And obviously, I think back then it raised a question and raised a warning light. How can an event that's obviously so trivial, it's a football game, it's nothing, how can you generate emotions that are that powerful? And that's because it's no longer, the point was, for him, it was no longer a game. The team became part of who he was, this anonymous fan all those decades ago. And I remember the danger is that, and this has come, the opposition in the Jewish world, the opposition in the Torah world to sports is because it crosses the line from becoming recreation to becoming something to do with identity. And I remember, again, as a young teen, when Rav Chaim Pinchas Scheinberg, Rosh Yeshiva of Torah Or, came to visit, he'd gone around the world. And this is, as many people then heard him say, he would say the same, and I imagine he said it to audiences of teens in kind of yeshiva high school settings. And I remember him with his being obviously puzzled by his dressed in these enormous layers of tzitzis. But equally what stuck in my mind was his reference to the Yankees, the New York baseball team, in which he said it kind of, even decades and decades after he's last followed the game, hearing about the Yankees, it raised some type of flutter inside him, and how long it had been till late in life it stayed with him. And it was a remarkable line, I think, because it captured something about that lingering power of childhood and teenage investment, and his honesty and a sweet and charming honesty and gadlus in saying that even after a lifetime of Torah greatness and investments in the Beis HaMedrash, the emotional residue still remained. And I think that that's the issue, is not the recreation itself. The issue is what recreation becomes. That was Rav Chaim Pinchas Scheinberg. But there's actually a reason that it took an American gadol to say something like that, whereas you would never conceivably hear the same line about in the Israeli context from a gadol from Eretz Yisrael. And the reason is simply because of the total divergence between the American Orthodox and, by extension, yeshiva world and that of Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, the outright rejection and antipathy to sports that you see in Israeli Haredi society, where Chadorim, they range from banning football to kind of grudgingly tolerating it, that's totally at odds with the experience in America, where even yeshivas have traditionally been far more open to sports. And why is that? Why is the divergence? I think obviously it gets to the heart. This is a very vexing subject for anyone who moves from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael, and they encounter the Israeli Haredi chinuch system, and then the Americans just are totally bemused by this. Without getting into the wrongs and rights and who's right on this, I think it's actually a very interesting point just to trace the divergence and where this begins over here. Because obviously you can say it's part of broadly a very different outlook. You're going to find the intensity of the rejectionism that's at the heart of Israeli Haredi society is not paralleled elsewhere in overseas, in Europe and in America to the same degree. And that is, it gets to the heart of the difference in the societies. But I'd like to pinpoint and suggest one name and one date. I think it stretches back in large part to one man, that's Max Nordau, in 1898 at the Second Zionist Congress in Basel, where Nordau, who was one of the founders of the World Zionist Organization and a contemporary of Theodor Herzl, gave a famous speech in which he called for muscular Judaism. Now, it's a very interesting thing because muscular Judaism was a phrase that did not emerge in a vacuum. the muscular Christianity movement began in 19th century England, and it was the idea that, physical strength and athleticism and outdoor activity and sort of generally vigorous manhood, they were the essentials of being a Christian. And it was kind of a reaction against the image of religion as kind of weak and passive and bookish. And so that was the 19th century, the muscular Christian idea. Those you can trace it very much in the development of the English public schools, the schools for the elite, where they provided extensive facilities and also emphasis on sports, because sports would round out the Christian gentleman. Sports would create a healthy, vigorous individual who's going to be a British imperial soldier or statesman or leader of something like that. That was muscular Christianity, but it spread the idea to Europe. And Nordau adapted it and called for muscular, he called it muscular Judentums, a Judaism of the muscles. As a remarkable speech that he gave in 1898, in which he said that Zionism breathes new life into Judaism, right? Reading it in this way and call it remarkable does not indicate, obviously, an endorsement, but these are his words. This much I am sure of. It does this morally by refreshing the ideals of the people, physically by the physical education of our offspring, who shall reestablish a bygone muscular Judaism. And that idea, the idea that Jews, the Golos Jew, the ghetto Jew, had become this thin, anemic, bookish, short-sighted, pale, pasty Ashkenazi, he was rejecting that. He was saying the Zionist Jew has to be a new Jew. We have to replace the weak and pale Jew of exile, the Jew who bent over a sefer with, a myopic vision. You have to have a new Jew, a strong, athletic, sunburnt and self-confident pioneer. And that, it's amazing, because to trace from that speech, obviously a speech was always going to be a reaction to cultural trends, and obviously it was beforehand. But the speech was very much a landmark, and within months, after Nordau's speech, the first Jewish sports club was founded in Berlin called Bar Kochba, obviously with the associations of Jewish strength. And Nordau would describe Bar Kochba as the last globally historic embodiment, meaning the original Bar Kochba, of a battle-hardened, weapon-ready Judaism. They were specifically, clearly rejecting the Golos archetype and saying, we need a new one. And so he said, we're going to need a broad-chested, strong-armed, bold-looking men. I mean, it couldn't be clearer, the link between that and the fact that the Jewish sporting movement, we know afterwards the Maccabi Games, the Maccabiah, founded in 1903. By the 1930s, it has this 40,000 members. And as Nazism, has this, it mounted the Maccabi Games, which were the Jewish Olympics. And I think, therefore, you see, it's a crucial point to understand the divergence of what's happened in Israel and overseas. Because in the Israeli and Zionist context, sport was never just sport. It was part of a project for a new Jew. And football was never just a game. It was a statement about the modern Jew. And I think that helps explain why opposition to sports in parts of the Israeli Haredi world is often far more emotionally charged and visceral than it is in America. You'll hear far more about Yavon and Yavon and Yavon than you're going to hear in America. And if I'm looking back at my own status over the last few days, where you see that the number of from people following the Knicks game, the number of them following and posting about it is way out of proportion than anything you're going to find in Israel among equivalent people. And I think, therefore, even in England, you're not going to find that. And you're going to go to a ball game. If you go to England, how many people with men with a beard, rabbinic-looking men with a beard are going to be seen at a football game? Very rare. Whereas you're going to see this in America, ball games. It has a totally different status and resonance. Because in America, sports madness was just another mad aspect of America, of Americana. Baseball and basketball and football are just kind of facts woven into American life. So if you resist Americanism, then you're going to resist perhaps sports in that sense, but just as an expression and an aspect of American culture and identity. But in Israel, the symbolism is far more loaded, because over here, sport was associated with the Zionist project of remaking the Jew himself. It wasn't just a battle against football. It was what football came to represent. It wasn't a rejection, therefore, of recreation and of relaxation and of entertainment. It was a rejection of the culture of the new Jew. If I were a mashgiach of a yeshiva with a room full of sports-mad bochrim, there's one guest that I would bring in from Israel, a man called Rabbi Snir Goeta. Today, Rabbi Snir Goeta is a Rav. He's got a community in Sderot, and he goes across giving very riveting and interesting, you can find him online, giving shiurim, speaking about the Torah and Emunah. But before that, and you can look back, Snir Goeta, before the rabbi, he was the real thing. He was a professional footballer who rose through the ranks of Israeli football, and he was a teenage prodigy. He was a very young star, and he was even touted as moving to Everton, which is a big football side team in England. When he speaks about football and its problems, he speaks from the inside. And I had Shavuos a few years ago, a most fascinating interview with him, which went obviously under the title Life Goals. And the value, I think, of that interview, so I walked away with a few very interesting insights that only a top professional former sportsman could have given. And I think the value of those words, because that today, whereas once the Bali Tshuva were drawn from, the elite of once upon a time, 60, 50 years ago, with the elite fighter pilots, some of whom became Bali Tshuva, and afterwards there were celebrities such as Uri Zohar, who himself had a very powerful message about the movie world of Hollywood. But today you actually have a trend of Israeli sportsmen becoming Bali Tshuva. And the impact, it have very widespread impact, because when these people talk, they're able to talk to Israeli youth and tell them what it's actually like. And I think that's why I found Snir Goeta's story so compelling. Because one of the things that struck me about what he was saying was the sheer single-mindedness needed to become a top-level footballer, again, to almost be exported to one of England's major teams. Because, as he said, most people who go through the elite soccer academies don't make it. They're just filtered out because they lack the talent or the commitment to make it happen. And he told me that as a teenager, he knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted to be on the football cards collected by Israeli children. And he wanted to provide a parnasa for his family, and he did for many years, because in the football academy, they lived in this, and the wage that he made as a teenager was enough to support his family. And actually, in talking in terms of single-minded dedication, Snir Goeta tells, when he's talking to me, I had a fascinating conversation with him. He said, we have the Gemara talks about Rish Lakish, who was the bandit who abandoned banditry and accepted Torah on himself. And as soon as he accepted on himself, he didn't have the ability to leap back across the river. And he said that the Torah weakens a person. In other words, once, that was the message of Rish Lakish, once you rededicate, when you take those energies away from being a highwayman and put them into being a Talmud Chacham, you do not have enough energy to compete at the top level in both things. And that is what Rabbi Snir Goeta told me. He said that what happened is he became Bal Tshuva, and as he started keeping Shabbos, he dropped out of the top league because it played on Shabbos. So he said, okay, let me continue making a parnasa from it. As he was considering learning and he entered Koilel, he wanted to make a parnasa. He said, fine, let me make a smaller parnasa, but support myself in Koilel, in learning, by playing in the lower leagues. But he said the most incredible thing happened. As soon as he dedicated his life to learning, like Rish Lakish, he simply could not do it anymore. He couldn't even function in Israel's third league, right, which is third division. And so he said, that was a Rish Lakish experience. And so I walked away, and his message was, again, if the madness about sport, it requires total dedication. You cannot have both. You could take an interest in sport. You can, as he does today, play a bit of recreational football. But the utter dedication it takes from a sportsman is not possible to have. You're either in or you're out. And so that is like a kind of very interesting takeaway that he shared. But there's another takeaway that he shares with me, and what I suppose he shares with a lot of Israeli teens who are very enamored of all the lure, the glamour, the glitz of those packed stadiums, and there's the wealth that's available. He said, that's only from the outside. What players see is something else. And this is what I quote from an interview. No one but a footballer knows what a cruel world it is. When you hit 30, your body betrays you. You're not that fast, you get injured, and the fans who once cheered ignore you, and you find yourself sitting on the bench. And he said, I see today my friends who didn't accompany me on my journey, right? Today, he's a Rav, an incredible person, a Talmud Chacham, who got smicha. I see my friends, they're broken and they're searching for a new life. And that's why if I could bring Snirgueta to those who are just have trouble seeing the problems in the total madness of the sports world, when it crosses from becoming a recreation to identity, it's become something that you're passionate about, it's something that from the inside itself is nowhere near as glamorous. Okay, that's the Mashgiach talking. To conclude this episode on sports, on football, on sports, and the interaction between that and our way of thinking, with one lasting, I suppose, anecdote you can call it. Almost every Elul, you can see it. It's a football stadium, often Beitar Yerushalayim's, and the tens of thousands of traditional Sephardi fans are packed into the stands. And these are people who take football very seriously. They'll come and they'll pay and they'll wear the club colours. And they know every player, every statistic, and every rivalry. But over the last few years, every Elul, almost without fail, you see the same thing happen. As Slichas is the time for Slichot, right? Because they're following the league, but at the same time, that night, they're going to go to Slichot. And somebody starts singing Adon HaSlichot. Adon HaSlichot. And the beautiful, haunting tune, Sephardi tune, sweeps through the terraces and the stands. And suddenly, instead of the chants about football, which they were before, the Beitar Yerushalayim, the thousands of voices are roaring, Adon HaSlichot bochen levavot. And the stadium becomes this giant choir. And for me, I find this incredibly moving. These clips get forwarded and find their way across in the big, wide Jewish world again, almost every year. And they are moving because they're a reminder that Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, is a big and complicated place. Yes, Jewish tradition often viewed sports with suspicion, right? Going back to Tur Malka, destroyed because of a ball. There's something, Yavon of Greece, of the worship of the body, in the glorification, the obsession with athleticism and physical prowess. And obviously, it would be a lot better if some of those fans were sitting over a Gemara. But that's not where Am Yisrael's up to. But Jews have a remarkable habit of refusing to fit neatly into categories, because they have a habit of elevating things, of carrying Torah and tradition into unlikely places, even a football stadium. So even a crowd that has come to watch 22 men kick a leather ball into a net can be drawn and elevated from roaring out the club anthem to roaring out slichas. And that is, when I think about football, something that, together with the ideas about Yavon and Torah Shimon, it is something that I find uplifting. The idea that Am Yisrael is complicated and you can never write anyone off. Thank you for listening to Behind the Times. We appreciate you joining us as we explore the stories and people that shape Jewish history. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with friends. Until next time.